It was an absolutely shocking summer, but not a surprise.
The facts are that Australia is burning while we turn a blind eye to the driving force, which is climate change and a warming planet.
Former fire chiefs today announcing they'll be holding an emergency bushfire summit next year.
You need to bring together people from all sectors: farmers, health professionals, Indigenous people, firefighters.
The resources that we have to put into emergency services must be greatly increased, because we could have another year like this next year, and if not next year, the year after or the year after that. I think we've got to not think about last summer as a one-off series of events. It's a warning for the future.
The disasters that occurred last summer were fundamentally different, and so while Defence has been able to have good traction within its own department in acting upon climate change, the ability to take that message out of Defence and become part of a broader national security deliberation has been limited.
How limited?
By and large, the last 10 years have been a barren field for government action on climate change.
No more platitudes, no more weasel words. Let's get on with it.
Welcome to this final event in a remarkable series of roundtable discussions over the past 7 weeks, bringing experts from across the nation and overseas to reflect on the lessons from last summer's catastrophic bushfires in the context of accelerating climate change. The purpose of this event is to summarise the key findings of those informed discussions, reflected in a report that will be presented to federal, state and territory governments, with a panel of some of those experts under the auspices of the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, 33 former senior fire and emergency leaders, and the Climate Council. First, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and the Palawa people on whose country we're having this discussion, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I should also thank the generosity and commitment of supporters who have made this extended climate summit possible. 2020 has been an extraordinary year for all Australians, with the sweeping impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic coming so close on the heels of the bushfires. But while governments around Australia are now understandably focused on the immediate challenges posed by the pandemic, there is a huge ongoing price to be paid if they lose sight of that other existential challenge, climate change. As the bushfires have so vividly and painfully demonstrated, that challenge doesn't just relate to the future, it's here now. The fact is that broad-based strategies are urgently required to tackle these fundamental causes of climate change in a credible and effective way, while also adapting policies to prepare for the impacts of the climate change that has already happened. Impacts like the Black Summer bushfires, the droughts, the cyclones, the floods, both the frequency and the intensity. It is a statement of the bleeding obvious that Australians cannot afford another Black Summer of the most frightening fires any of us have ever witnessed. Nor can we afford to ignore the need for urgent action to reduce carbon emissions to net zero without further delay. The report we're analysing in this discussion contains 166 recommendations based on the science and on the vast accumulated experience of those who have fought the battles of the past and are now grappling with the catastrophic impact of the most fundamental political failures. Let me introduce our panellists. Greg Mullins is a former New South Wales Fire and Rescue Commissioner and founding member of the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. Cheryl Durrant is former Director of Defence Preparedness and Mobilisation with deep inside knowledge of the roles the Defence Force is increasingly being asked to play. Oliver Costello is the Chief Executive of the Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation with much needed expertise in cultural land management. Nikki Hutley is a partner of Deloitte Access Economics who has grappled with the harsh reality of cost, the massively increasing cost of bushfires fuelled by climate change and the cost of government action required to mitigate the impact of what's coming up the pipeline this summer and beyond. Dr. Cassandra Goldie is Chief Executive of the Australian Council of Social Services, ACOS, who knows the grim stories and the terrible human toll from events like those Black Summer bushfires, and has the policy expertise to tackle them in an effective way that is not always welcomed by government. Amanda Mackenzie is the Chief Executive of the Climate Council, made up of some of the country's leading climate scientists, plus leading experts in health and renewable energy. To you first, Greg Mullins, can you tell me briefly what this summit set out to achieve and what you've actually been able to do?
Sure, Kerry. Well, look, going back to December 2019, you may recall we had a press conference. There were 5 former fire chiefs, and we were frankly appalled at the lack of national leadership on the bushfires at the time, but denying that climate change had any role to play in those fires whatsoever. So in that leadership vacuum, we said that we would hold a national bushfire summit, and because we knew that there were so many people out there impacted by those fires, I think around 80% of Australians in some way were directly impacted or indirectly impacted, they needed to have a say. Now, since that time, the Royal Commission was established, bushfire inquiries in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and a Senate inquiry. But we were concerned with the very short reporting timetables that people who needed to have a say wouldn't have that opportunity. And we wanted a very broad mix of expertise, and that's why we held these roundtables. So we had thousands tune in on the first night, and we had hundreds of people participate in the roundtables.
So, I mean, there are a lot of recommendations. And I wondered immediately of the risk that there would be a kind of swamping effect. They read like a Royal Commission. Is it possible to separate what you might regard as the most important outcomes and recommendations?
Well, yes, it is. And it came through loud and clear. And the interesting thing was each of the roundtables had their number one issue was climate change, whether it was insurers, firefighters, people who'd lost their homes, veterinarians, doctors, economists, cultural experts and Indigenous, First Nations people. Each and every one of them said something is seriously wrong, and that something is that warming climate leading to disasters like this. No matter what we do, we're not going to be able to prevent, prepare, respond or recover from these escalating emergencies if we don't dial down the heat at some stage. So we need urgent action on emissions, and that's the policy vacuum we're dealing with at the moment. There'll be lots of things happen in the response space, and frankly, I'm a former fire chief, I'm a current volunteer firefighter. Doesn't matter how many aircraft, fire trucks or firefighters you throw at this problem, it's not enough anymore.
So, but specifically from the point of view of firefighting, what are the standout recommendations from you?
Look, standout recommendations are better resourcing for fire and emergency services and land management agencies like national parks. So it's no good just adding to the national parks estate, but reducing the number of rangers and remote area firefighters in forestry and national parks. First attack strategy, so a different fleet of aircraft to what we have at the moment and more of them, but an Australian fleet, because overlapping fire seasons with the Northern Hemisphere, we can't rely on their assets any longer.
And that was an important aspect. There was a reliance on resources being able to come from the Northern Hemisphere up to now.
It's almost a 100% alliance. We have one large aircraft in Australia, and so we have to lease all of them from Canada and the US, and there's a huge overlap between fire seasons now. So last year, California was still burning in November, and we were months into our fire season by then, so we couldn't get all the aircraft that we needed. So that's a big one. But bringing back and resourcing cultural burning practices, because the people who looked after this land for 60,000 years actually know what they're talking about, but they can't, it's not a free good. People, that's like in the Northern Territory, rangers, Indigenous rangers are paid to do this work. So we need to resource these people so that they can teach us how to look after country far better. And look, national coordination, we need to learn from the Peak Council, the AFAC, the Australasian Fire and Emergency Service Authorities Council. They've been doing it because of the vacuum in Canberra. So we need to beef up national coordination arrangements, but leverage the relationships and the expertise that AFAC have built up. So a lot of different things, and defence, and Cheryl's right across this, I'm sure she'll speak about it, but we don't want defence to fight fires, but the incredible engineering and support capabilities that they have, we need to leverage those far better.
So how do you compel governments to take 166 recommendations seriously?
Look, we can't compel, but we're going to ask nicely. We've written to the Prime Minister again, and senior ministers will be writing to every Premier, every Emergency Service Minister in every state and territory, offering these. We'll be giving these recommendations to the Royal Commission, and I'm actually pleased that they've extended their timeline, because this will give them time to consider these recommendations and the New South Wales inquiry.
Cheryl Durrant, before we get to recommendations in relation to the increasing need for defence support in crises like the Black Summer fires and even the current pandemic, suddenly we're getting used to defence being called on for all kinds of stuff. What has climate change meant, and what will it mean into the future for demand on defence personnel and resources within Australia?
Simply, in a nutshell, Kerry, what it means is more demand. More demand, as we saw last summer with the bushfires, with bigger bushfires, more widespread, lasting longer. But also more demand for responses to flood and drought, which we've also seen and experienced in Australia in recent years. And this comes at the same time that defence is also facing more demand due to other climate-related activities, such as potential for state collapse, state fragility, and mass migration. And that's also at the same time there's more demand for other defence activities, such as in countering rise of China, which is causing tension between great powers, and also to develop more capabilities for information operations and cyber warfare. So at some point in time, with the climate change not being addressed, these things just get larger, bigger, and more frequent. And at some point in time, there isn't enough defence to go around.
But in looking ahead, in the certain knowledge of greater frequency of weather crises and the greater intensity of weather events, from the defence perspective, is it just a matter of increasing the size and capacity of defence to fulfil an expanded role? Will it be as simple as that?
No, Kerry, it's not as simple as that, because we clearly don't want to see investment in defence to do things they're not best placed to do. And we've already heard from Greg about the need to have more aerial firefighting resources and more firefighters. We don't want to make defence firefighters, but we do want to make sure they do have the capabilities to support our emergency service responders. We've also seen with COVID, there's an increasing demand on defence for the type of pandemic that climate change also makes more likely. But there's also more demand for transport, there's more demand for investment in infrastructure, there's more demand for community services and for disaster recovery. And so at some point in time, there's just not enough money to fund it all. And what I heard from the workshops repeatedly was not requests for less of anything, but requests for more of anything. So what there is really needed is an overarching prioritisation framework and a long-term plan.
How close are we to having a proper national strategy for dealing with the security challenges of climate change? One that actually effectively integrates civil and defence agencies?
I think we're still a fair way away from that, Kerry. You would have seen that the recent Defence Strategic Update really just focused on defence issues. It's a little bit about bushfires, but not much at all on climate change. At the same time, our Foreign Affairs and Trade strategy also hasn't really gripped up and addressed this issue. Neither has Home Affairs or any of the other traditional security agencies of state. So what we're calling for as a recommendation out of the forum and the workshops is a national security strategy. We think it's critical that something sits on top the various agencies and various bits of government so that the priorities can be put in the right place and we're delivering bang for the buck to the taxpayer, for the taxpayer.
The military habitually conducts quite elaborate exercises in order to be combat ready, even when there's no immediate likelihood of combat. Will that approach have to be applied more widely in the context of what we're talking about?
Yes, Kerry. One of the things the National Security Strategy should do is basically set a priority for a rolling program of domestic disaster response exercises with Defence, but also integrating Defence with other emergency responders, state governments and local and community groups. One of the things that came quite strongly back to me from the workshops was that while the Defence responders on the ground did a terrific job, sometimes the chain of command or the communications or the integration or the working together piece wasn't as slick as it could have been. And that had to be fixed up on the day. So what an exercise program does is it irons out those problems ahead of the disasters rather than trying to fix them in the disasters. And so this needs to be fully resourced and inclusive of Defence and all the other emergency responders. And the final point I'd like to make is that a national security program of major exercises, domestic disaster response exercises, needs to be fully funded, because the real three bits of a problem are understanding the risks, understanding the capabilities we need, and understanding the costs, because that's the only way you get really good priority across all our resources.
Of course, Nikki Hutley, what Cheryl Durrant has been highlighting would come at a substantial financial cost. Of course, everything does. But that's just one part of the picture, isn't it, when it comes to proper financing of critical resources?
Well, that's right, Kerry, and there's a whole range of things that we need to consider, but, you know, as every good economist will tell you, we need to do a good cost-benefit analysis. And when you look at the potential costs, not just of bushfires, which are extraordinary, but of all natural disasters, these are escalating. Our research suggests it could get to $39 billion a year by 2050, and was before we'd had the, you know, something like around $5 billion. The cost of the bushfires is the sort of vague estimate that we've got, and that's just the direct economic impacts. You know, this is affecting not just you know, mental health and well-being. We know there's health costs, but also the psyche of the nation. You know, we're seeing this with COVID. COVID actually is providing really good lessons for us as to what more and more extreme events will do in terms of disruption and the despair, and what that does flows through to the economy. These all have dollar values. So when we think about both the mitigation that we need to do, that Greg was talking about, to stop the emissions, to move to net zero, there are lots of great economic opportunities. Lots of people are writing about them already, but also it's the avoided costs that we've got to look at. So not having lives lost, not losing property, not causing physical, mental, emotional damage to people, you know, building better communities. Because when we invest in these better resilient infrastructure, we're actually creating new jobs as well. And we're also giving people that confidence that they are going to be able to deal with these increasing events. Because Greg's right, you know, whatever we do tomorrow, we're still going to face a lot more disasters in the year to come, unfortunately. And we need to be absolutely prepared. We will save enormous amounts of money. We will avoid big costs, which is, of course, the other side of a benefit. So the benefits to be gained from acting now are very, very large.
But how do you actually calculate those? Because I think politicians deal in figures, don't they? And they have to be led to believe those figures.
Well, they do, but this is actually standard economics practice. In fact, health economics is built all around avoided costs. We know that when we invest in a particular program, we can say we are, if it were only just saying we are not going to lose 500 lives, those all have a statistical value. Now, of course, the value of somebody's life is very different when it's your person than it is when it's just a statistic and faceless, nameless statistic. But we can actually quantify these things. We can quantify the value of property lost. We can quantify the mental health costs. But we do have to build a much better, more resilient and ongoing database to help support. We're learning fantastic lessons already from the data that's being collected around the summer bushfires. We need to keep doing that. We've got excellent resources from the Bureau of Statistics, other sources. We can quantify this. It's a hard task, but it can be done and it needs to be done.
How do you prioritise spending when it's across such a broad front? Funding for firefighting itself, funding to mitigate damage, funding for community mental health and welfare resources, as you say, to deal with the community fallout from the crises, and even the funding to help build community resilience.
Yeah, well, we would say you build a prioritisation framework, which is just a fancy way of saying what are the things that we can invest in that will give us the biggest bang for our buck. And it might be that across all of those things, there are a range of things that we can do that will deliver a positive return on investment, that will give us a greater benefit or avoided cost than it costs us to invest. Yes, it is true that resources are scarce. We may have to schedule a timeline and prioritise the ones we think are going to have the really big return on investment up front. But over time, we also need to understand that for every action we don't take, there's a cost down the track. And I know it's very hard for politicians, it's hard for people when they can't see an immediate impact. It's why people smoke and do other silly things. We need to see that, but we can measure this. We can put the figures on the table in front of them. So there's no excuses for not doing it. We have the evidence base to say this is the cost of you not acting.
Well, of course, politicians these days operate on very short-term cycles. They're much less interested in long-term dividends because they can't measure them at the next election. And I'm not saying that in a cynical way, it's just a reality. And you've now got an economy that's thrown completely out of whack to the extent that we are shaping for our worst economic scenario in 90 years. So how do you make these figures speak powerfully enough to move past that?
Gosh, just look to the International Monetary Fund that's talking about greener, smarter, fairer. We actually invest in green infrastructure, in investments to get to net zero, because this is going to create jobs and help our economy. This is the type of stimulus we actually need to help our economy get out of the hole that it's currently in. So it's win-win all round. This is the perfect time. COVID has actually created probably a unique situation where for once politicians can look a little bit beyond the current cycle and say, we have the opportunity to take something that's quite disastrous and use it towards our advantage. They say Australia is very good at managing adversity. Well, let's prove that that's true.
Of course, when we talk about resilience in the community and things like mental health and so on, that's familiar territory for you, Cassandra Goldie. You've run the national peak body representing all the major organisations in the community service sector for the past decades. Your constituents have copped the double whammy of bushfires and pandemic because they're the ones really in the firing line, aren't they? What are the big lessons learnt as far as you're concerned from the Black Summer fires?
Well, I must say, when I saw you, Greg, speaking in those early days in the face of this devastating bushfire effect, it was again really heartening to hear that we were not being required to say we can't talk about the horrors of the impact of climate change because we're dealing with the bushfires in front of us. Because we've always said, Kerry, for a decade and more, that if you are serious about looking after the interests of people who have the least, you know that we've got to tackle climate change and take it very seriously, because globally we know that it is people who have the least who are hit the hardest, the longest and the worst. And we'll hear shortly from you, Oliver. We know First Nations communities know that extremely well. Local communities know that well. And I think what we saw when we were talking about the politics of this, what we've seen over this summer was local politicians closest to their communities, knowing the vulnerabilities in their communities, knowing that it was people who had nothing to start off with, who now in many ways that hope that they will ever get something more behind them, brings that determination. And so I completely agree with Nikki that this is a time where local politicians can drive this hopeful agenda in a very difficult year. There's no question this has been devastating for people, but there are people we've heard in these roundtables, they got on the Zoom, they were there helping that day, local people who'd still had nothing, and they were there on the Zoom saying, we want to drive this change in our local communities. And that's where I see all the hope. There is this strength to community resilience. Yes, it means that we have to have appropriations. We want now, in the face of the next summer coming up, for government to have a plan to say we will resource locally first and most, because that's where the strength will be. We know where our communities are. We know how most vulnerable community members are. We've been through this devastation. We know what the emergency action is that's needed. We'll bring through our plan. You've got to have our backs to do that. And I think that's where the power of this could lie, rather than your sort of big bureaucracy associated with it. I think there's a real lesson to be learned there.
But how do you target that? I mean, when you say resource locally, you're resourcing local communities.
So, for example, key recommendation out of this summit has been that we invest in local community disaster management hubs, where you bring together the strength of community leadership, and I mean community in the broader sense. Great local community government leaders, like business leaders, First Nations leaders, families who've seen it all and they never want it to happen to their children next time round. The energy at that local level is very real, and with a sense of purpose, that's how you deal with the mental health challenge. People see the hope that they've got some control and agency. I'm really convinced that if the government was prepared to resource those local community hubs, local leaders would gather around it and bring best the sharpest advice about in their region with the technical expertise that's located in that region. We know what we need to get to do our prioritisation around investment dollar for dollar. This is how to make our communities as strong as we can be for the next time this occurs, and be a part of those jobs that are about greener and smarter and fairer, local community jobs.
You've observed that communities in Victoria were stronger on the ground than anywhere else in response to last summer's fires. Now, I assume there's some connection back to the Black Saturday fires, but how did that manifest itself?
Definitely, and this is globally well understood, that where communities have been through crises, it strengthens the community for the next time round. And so ways of working together have been built over this terrible summer. People have forged new relationships of strength. And what we saw in Victoria was those lessons that were learned from the previous, large-scale devastation of those fires had a long tail effect, and a government that understood how important it was for community leaders to be at the table for the disaster management plan. So I think there's something here about, on the one hand, yes, we need the so-called boots on the ground. We need the planes, we need the hardware, we need the Defence Force people, but we also need the community leaders in those rooms so that we are working arm in arm together, because there is all aspects about looking after people as well as looking after the confronting reality of stopping the fires. So I think some of that early planning together was missing. Victoria was better than others because it realised the price you paid when you didn't have that community wisdom in there, because once the cameras move on from a terrible bushfire, it will be the local community people who are there for as long as it takes.
The summit has called for a National Disaster Resilience Fund, with contributions required from the fossil fuel industry. Well, I can hear the response to that from the fossil fuel industry, but what would that fund be used to do? I mean, it's a nice kind of vague term, a resilience fund.
Yeah, well, there is an ability when you put resources into the hands of people who have a very clear purpose, they will spend them well. So this is instead of a government plan sitting in Canberra with a bucket of money saying, oh, we're now going to spend it here, there, and we're going to make our own decisions about exactly how those funds are appropriated. This is the notion of we're going to go bottom up. Now, I heard that many times over the course of this summer, that we needed local community-led empowerment to really respond appropriately to keep people safe. And so this would be a fund that would then be available for those kinds of plans to be brought through and say, in our region, this is what we need now to do the mapping of who's most at risk, to do a mapping of where we don't have the strength of community capability, to be able to invest in the hardware we need, and bring that through as a sophisticated plan. And the fund is there to respond to that rather than governments trying to dictate all the detail, because we're a very big country and a very variable land, and what is needed on the ground is not always the same.
One other perspective in all this that's been largely absent until recently, particularly in land and fire management, is a strong Indigenous voice. Oliver Costello, what solutions did your roundtable highlight in terms of genuinely and effectively integrating Indigenous knowledge and cultural burning into land management practices?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. I'd firstly just like to start by acknowledging country and thanking you for doing so earlier. It's really important that we acknowledge traditional custodianship and the role that our ancestors have played to shape the landscape and the responsibility that comes with that. In the roundtables, we talked a lot about what needs to change. It's been great seeing the shift that's happened over the last few years, and particularly the last few months, around the interest that people are showing around what is cultural fire management, how does it work, and what can we do to change. And what we need to do to change is we actually need to, as Greg said earlier, we need to invest in it. You know, our resource economies that sustained us for thousands of years, where we learnt cultural fire management, where a reciprocal relationship with the land, where we looked after it and it provided. In modern context, we don't have that relationship opportunity anymore because the land's been taken away largely, and our relationships to land have been severed in lots of places. So we need to rebuild those relationships. We need to be able to support that ongoing management that's required. And so being able to build effective partnerships with government, NGOs, philanthropics, everybody that wants to see that change is one thing. But then I guess moving away from some of the current land management practices, and, you know, more broadly, while we're here talking about climate change, like climate change is the direct result of people being disconnected from the land and not reading the land, not looking after country. When we look after country with cultural fire, we're applying fire based on local indicators. But more broadly, we're looking after country. We're looking after the atmosphere, we're looking after our neighbours, our kinship. And being able to understand that is a really important way of being with country. And today, I guess, is a real opportunity for everyone to start to understand what it means, what it feels like to have that connection, and to see all these external pressures coming in and overwhelming your resilience because you don't have that capability to be able to respond locally. And so the more we understand that opportunity through what cultural fire teaches us to respond to the immediate challenges, but also start to help teach ways of being which actually look after the whole environment and beyond the seas of the shores that we live on here across the whole world, and we'll be in a better position to respond to future challenges.
So in terms of the practicalities, how would an Indigenous-led cultural fire strategy work within a broader national fire strategy framework? I mean, how would that interface work, and what would it produce?
Well, it needs to be community-led. It needs to be ground up, and that's what I guess Fire Sticks has been able to achieve, is to start to build a framework. And there's lots more work to be done to build an Indigenous-led framework where people that speak for country are empowered to burn and to teach others. And so,
but you're working in partnership, theoretically, with fire authorities for a start. That would be the fundamental one, wouldn't it? But there'd have to be a mutual kind of respect there and a genuine commitment to cooperation.
Yeah.
You can't be working side by side, but each running your own separate agendas. Now, what is the potential? Is that already happening?
Well, I think that's what's already happening in the state and federal land management agencies as it is now. There is this kind of parallel stories happening on, and what we're asking for is everyone coming together. That's what happened, you know, it's not just Black Summer. These fires started in late winter, you know. It was a very long fire season, well beyond summer, and there's many more to come if we don't start to change the way we manage our global atmosphere. We need to fight climate change, we need to reduce emissions. But this is not an old story for us. This is what happens when you break law. Fire teaches law. You know, when lightning strikes, it's teaching us law, and it's teaching us about how fire and how plants and animals can coexist. And so we need to take this lesson, and COVID's added to that. We need to take this lesson, and how do we actually work together? How do we coordinate a community-led response? We need to drive that change by looking at what's around us, not what's over there. What's over there is what you look at when you're over there. We need to be focused on where we are in the landscape and responding to those indicators. So, you know, the canopy, the grass, you know, the plants, the animals, we need to be responding to that. So if we continue to focus on fuel and risk and burn the wrong way, like a lot of these impacts of these fires have been exacerbated by fire agency and land management agencies not applying the right fire. So we're willing to work, we've been offering, and our whole practice is based on giving and building partnerships, but that needs to be reciprocal, because at the moment the power imbalance is very big. And we've got all these policies and all these regulations in our way, and all the resources are largely sitting in government. So that needs to change. There needs to be resourcing of Indigenous-led fire practitioners to be able to go out, practice their craft, teach people that want to learn the right way, maintain that cultural learning pathway so that it can continue into the future, because this is only a few hundred years that we're looking at. We've got thousands of years of land management ahead of us if we want to still exist in these landscapes. Yes,
well, that is a long-term view, Oliver. I'm not sure how fashionable that is in Canberra, but anyway. Are there any examples, have you experienced examples where there is good interface between the traditional authorities, the fundamental agencies and Indigenous culture?
Yeah, no, there's some great examples, but it's mainly people. Like, it's mainly good people that, you know, like a ranger or an area manager or, you know, a firefighter that wants to work with us. As a whole, the systems are not functioning in a way that respects Aboriginal people's knowledge and practice. We are continually, you know, suppressed and, you know, oh, we want to do this. Oh, what do the rules say? Your rules don't work. Clearly your rules are not working. What about our rules, the ones that work, the ones that have been working for thousands of years? So there's still that, there's this reciprocal relationship's not quite right, but there's some really great people in the agencies. There's some policy changes. Really, it's really good to see. You know, I used to work for national parks. The policy that we helped develop, like that's helping to, but it's never been resourced and funded. There's no structural change in the organisation to be able to actually enhance the bushfire mitigation program to actually deal with Indigenous-led fire management. And in Victoria, the strategy that the government's funded there is really important too. So there is action happening, but it's not enough. And I think, you know, now's the time to actually come together, and we've been calling for this. And if we can fund a national strategy, bring together First Nations, cultural fire practitioners to lead that change, well then we'll be in a better position to deal with the fires to come.
Are there enough Indigenous people with the knowledge and the practical skills who could be seriously engaged in firefighting and prevention strategies?
Oh, there's thousands of Aboriginal people in communities all through Australia, well placed, but there is...
But with that knowledge base?
There's been a dramatic loss of knowledge in lots of areas, but the country is still there and people want to practice their culture. So we need to remove the policy and the regulatory barriers that have created that disturbance in our practice and create that change. Because that's what, like, I'm here, you know, as a testament to that. Like, I've learnt cultural fire management in my lifetime, like everybody else that's learnt it through that. So just create the opportunity, my kids, the next generation, like, let's just create those opportunities, because otherwise we're just going to be having the same conversation again and again and again. And we've developed a methodology that can see this happen. So all we need to do is roll it out.
Of course, the firefighting authorities and people who've come up as firefighters over 20 and 30 years at the point where they run these organisations, they've got their own traditions.
Absolutely.
And those traditions are not all badly placed. So how do you go about developing a healthy interface? I mean, is it unheard of that you could invite firefighting senior management, the actual commissioners, to come out and look at what you do?
We've had plenty of senior fire practitioners come to our events, and a lot of them see the opportunity and are supporting us now, but I guess we need more. We need to probably get higher level support. Yeah. We've been having these conversations for years, and I think it's partly to do with a misunderstanding about what we're talking about, you know, because everyone thinks like hazard reduction, wildfire when they talk about fire. We're talking about a totally different type of fire. You've actually got to see it. And when people see it often too, they go, oh, well, how does that have an impact? Go and look, we can go and show you the places where it's had an impact, where the canopies are still intact, where the animals are still there, because we've implemented fires.
So fire's gone through.
Fire's gone through and the fire's gone out.
But the fundamentals that will allow that forest to continue to exist survive.
It's a different approach, and that's the problem. Like, there's a real combat mentality in the fire industries, and that's because of, I guess, how the fire industry's developed. We can't fight country. We can't fight the environment. It's the provider of our existence. We need to understand how to work with it and reciprocate. And so there's a fundamental blockage in the values of the way the current systems work. It's to, fight. Not, and the same with climate change. Don't fight it. Actually understand how to support the change. How do we do the right thing by the land and the people of the land, so that we can have that change. So there's a cultural shift that needs to happen, and it needs to happen in all of us to be able to understand what it means. Otherwise, we're sort of talking in two different conversations. Yeah.
The elephant in the room, of course, is climate change, but it's become impossible to ignore. Amanda McKenzie, what do you do with this report from the Climate Council's perspective? How can you turn it into effective action on climate change, particularly when governments are grappling as they are fundamentally with the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely, Kerry. It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And through the summer, when the fires were burning and there was so much focus, we saw this huge renewed interest in climate change. And I think that sits in a latent way in the community right now. While COVID is a pressing challenge, I think the dual crises this year have made Australians realise that we are actually vulnerable to these huge global issues. And what we've seen in the last few months is an increasing pressure coming from all sorts of different parts of society, big business, industry, community, state and territory governments, saying the COVID recovery has to involve tackling climate change. So it's about getting people into jobs, but also tackling long-term issues, setting us up for the future. And we've just released a report last week showing that you can create 76,000 jobs, clean jobs, in getting people back to work and tackling climate change at the same time.
What did you personally get from the summit?
I found the summit really inspiring and educative. And one of the things that stood out to me was hearing from a number of fire experts about how the previous view of we need to contain fires when they start versus extinguish them. The view is now that we need to be extinguishing fires in really severe conditions because of what we saw during Black Summer. And that requires a very high-tech, nimble response. It's a much more costly response because you have to have that technology and you have to have crews that are much more able to get places quickly, sometimes in remote landscapes. But these are the sorts of things emergency service experts are now considering to make sure that we can better protect our landscapes and property and human life.
And what were the most important themes as far as you're concerned?
I think the top theme that kept coming out was climate change. There was emergency services involved, scientists, health responders, community sector, First Nations people, survivors, a really broad range of people involved. And they kept coming up with, well, we need to do a whole range of things to prepare better, to fight fires better, but ultimately we have to tackle climate change. And if we're not doing that, it's relatively pointless how we prepare. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the fear that had been borne out by Black Summer that governments had consistently underestimated the scale of the challenge upon us. And so whether it was through climate denial at the extreme end or whether it was just thinking it wouldn't be as bad as scientists have said, have led us down a pathway where we haven't prepared our emergency services adequately, we don't have adequate resources, we haven't done the innovative thinking about solutions, and communities are suffering as a consequence. So even the aspect around defence, for instance, defence coming in relatively late through the summer, I think is a symptom of that attitude. So the concern was we need to make sure that everyone understands that climate change is well underway and these fires, this will only get worse and worse. I think Cheryl has said before that we need to prepare for the events that we haven't seen before, and that kept emerging. And the final thing was around recovery and preparedness being linked. I thought this was a really fascinating point, that how you prepare communities is often linked to how well they recover. So one of the ideas is around that comes out really strongly in the report and the recommendations is community hubs, so that you invest in communities that are vulnerable now and build up resilience, build up the capacity of that community to then recover later on. That's really a big theme through the whole report and is an important one.
The summit report recommendations related to firefighting and community protection represent significant cost. Then there's the potential cost to the economy of dramatically reducing carbon emissions to net zero, an economy that's now in its worst shape for nearly 90 years, as I talked about with Nikki a short while ago. How do you sell that?
Well, that's the impossible thing to sell, because we've been previously trying to sell that over many years. So I remember when I started working in climate change, all these events that we're seeing now were considered very much future threats. And communicating about future threats that people haven't seen yet is very challenging. So I think the best we can do is keep illustrating as clearly as possible the local challenges, making it highly relevant to people today. And Black Summer illustrating the impact that climate change had on those events is one of the ways in which we can start helping people to imagine what the future will look like if we fail to take greater action. And unfortunately, because climate change is now well underway, things will get worse before they can get better. So it is one of those, it's a terrible issue to work on because you're trying to prepare people for avoiding the worst. You're not saying we're taking all this action so it will necessarily be better from a climate perspective. But I think the flip side of that is we won't get as far as we need to go just on the fear basis, on saying these are the things that will happen. We have to have a very positive, solutions orientated narrative that says this is how we can build a better country, a better world. And that's where that jobs modelling piece comes in, saying these are the jobs of the future. This is the economy we can build. The stories around Australia being a clean energy superpower that can be exporting our renewable energy to the world. Like, we need to inspire people about what we can build despite the grave challenges that we face.
Greg, Oliver was talking about not a clash of cultures, but an absence of interface, really, between the traditional firefighters of post-colonial Australia, if you like, and the firefighting culture of Indigenous Australians. Now, you yourself, when you were right in the front line, that was not really a part of your world, was it, the Indigenous knowledge and culture? No,
look, it's been fascinating listening to Ollie and other cultural fire experts and learning over the years. And what I've reflected on is the fire agencies are very much based on command and control and response and giving orders and having structure and processes, centralised administrations, and anything outside the box was very hard for us to deal with. And we certainly didn't have the resources to fund things. So it was, yeah, look, give it a go, but we'll tell you how and when. You have to have a permit for that. You can't burn there. You can't burn at this time. It's too restrictive. We need a bit of trust come into the system and work with people rather than try to control what's going on. And that's my reflection as a fire chief. We're control freaks.
But that would be a huge cultural shift.
It would be, but you're seeing you're seeing a cultural shift in the fire agencies because they recognise that while we're going to be required to put more and more effort into response as things get worse because of climate change, it's investing beforehand in communities, equipping communities, training communities, getting them to manage their own fire hazards. There's far more bang for the buck if we get ahead of the game, and if we can draw on this Indigenous knowledge which has been there for so long and get it across all tenures, all landscape scale, it's going to help. It won't, on its own, as Ollie said, a lot of knowledge has been lost and has to be rebuilt, but the fire agencies, the National Parks Forestry, need to help them to rebuild that without having to control it. So it takes a shift in mindset.
So given what you now know, what you've picked up from Ollie and others about what they might bring to the table, putting your firefighting hat on, if you were still back in that job, what would you be looking to take from that skills base and to practically use?
So what would I take? I'm not sure about taking things. I think it's partnering with and learning and watching and listening, but also integrating people with knowledge into the structures and processes, so district bushfire management committees, so that they have a voice and they're not just off to the side and look, when we have time we'll listen to them, because Ollie said it comes down to personalities. So if you have a really switched on local district ranger, there'll be things going on. But if you have a local fire officer who says, no, I'm too busy and it's all about response, nothing will happen. So,
but ultimately it's about changing or adding to or more than tinkering, actually remoulding, for instance, land management and fire practice.
It is, and look, a picture paints 1,000 words, and we need to get people, like when I was in my former job, out into the bush and watch what happens and go, wow, this is really sophisticated, and let's incorporate this and let's learn from it.
Of course, Nikki, we were talking about cost earlier. One of the groups of people in modern society who are absolutely switched on and focused on the impacts and the impacts down the pipeline of climate change is the insurance industry.
Absolutely, because they are seeing firsthand the cost. And we have seen the sort of criticism that's been launched at the sector, for example, over the inquiry into cyclone premia in Northern Australia and the accusations of price gouging. But in actual fact, as risk increases, obviously the premia are going to have to increase as well along with that. But interestingly, we worked with James Cook University for Suncorp a couple of years ago, looking at how you could put in different measures, invest in cyclone resilience. Some simple things like putting in shutters, making sure you've got things held down. There were more expensive measures like roof battening, but they were going to save householders and the insurance industry money over the life of those loans or those insurance policies, and therefore everybody was going to win out of it. It meant that if households invested up front, they could then get a lower premium, and that was actually implemented. So people did the right thing. We can do that for all natural disasters, and in fact, if we don't, we're just going to see burgeoning costs. People are starting to talk about having a national insurance pool. Well, we've seen it from America how expensive that can be. The thing is not to just say we'll just keep paying out more and more. The thing is to invest in the measures up front that will defer the impacts over time and the costs. Now, it is true that there are some measures that need to be taken where the lifetime sort of benefits of them don't necessarily meet the cost to the householder. But we know that, in an example, in fire, it's not just that householder that's bearing the cost. It flows on everywhere. If a tile blows off a roof from my house and hits your window, so there are all of these flow-on impacts. So there is also a role for government here to work out what are the benefits in terms of just not having huge disruption to the economy. So again, it all comes down to understanding the flow-on activity of the disaster and how that flows through supply chains, how it disrupts from the individual to the community to the broader economy. What does that actually mean? And then coming back and saying, all right, how much can we afford to invest? What are the best things that we can invest in that will lower the costs? It's not going to be the same for everyone, and some households can do a lot more. But if we have that resilience, that adaptation, that will help lower the insurance premium. And you're totally right. The industry is absolutely way ahead of the game in understanding and looking at where all the costs are, because they've got their bean counters going, this doesn't look good. And the finance industry more broadly. They've got, our superannuation industry is investing in assets everywhere that potentially are prone to not just physical damage from extreme climate events, but also that economic disruption. So everybody is starting to be aware. They have to report on their risks now. They're actually mandated, the top 100 companies. So there's more. We're going to see a lot more of this.
Now, one of the things that we've just really mentioned in passing and not dwelt on at all is the loss of species, the loss of animals. And when you get a figure like 1 billion animals estimated to have died in the summer fires, it's almost beyond comprehension to think of what that really means. 1 billion animals, and we're losing species anyway. So does anyone want to comment on that, the impact of that and why that should matter as a part of government planning?
Could I just throw in that was a big theme in the roundtables? People were very concerned about the logging of native forests in particular, something that we need to phase out like the Victorian government's committed to, but the loss of habitat and then the burning of habitat on top of that. So koalas could be extinct by 2050. This is frightening, and it needs a concerted effort, again, on revegetating areas, rehabilitating areas, but the proper burning programs, because some of the current burning practices actually exacerbate the fire risk over time. And so it really needs and look, I've got to say, I'm really pleased. Recently, the federal government announced additional funding for ongoing research, which we called for and others called for. So hopefully that'll be a big focus into the future.
Amanda, I can see you want to say something about this.
Thanks, Kerry. It's really hard to grapple with. The scale of loss that we've just experienced is absolutely mind-boggling, and the pandemic kind of coming in, I think, has postponed some of that grief that we as a collectively need to feel about what we've lost. These stunning, majestic forests that are our heritage, the huge amount of animals and wildlife that has been lost. And I think about my daughter. I'd read her books, and there's sort of children's books that you buy on the shelves, all are about Australian animals and Australian landscapes. And to me, that illustrates just how important it is to the Australian identity, our landscapes, our animals. It's what we see ourselves as. This is Australia, and what we're losing is a sense of national identity as we lose these forests, as we lose these animals. And that's the devastating thing of climate change is we're going to live through significant loss, and we need a way to process that, but we also need to use that loss as a galvanizing force. What we have lost over the summer should galvanize us to say we cannot lose this scale again. We must act on this issue. We must try ways of doing things that are different than what we've done before, like we need to extinguish the fires rather than contain them. These sorts of new ways of thinking fundamentally is shifting our way that we fight fires, that we prepare for them, that we prepare communities, and how we protect our wilderness, but also ultimately how we tackle climate change. Australia should see this as an opportunity to move to the front and say, we are losing what is most important to us and we won't let it happen. We will act.
Yeah, I've got to say, yeah, it's really troubling seeing, like how many, all that country that's been burnt and, being, able to sort of fly over it, on my way down to Sydney and sort of be able to read the country from the air and see the impacts. And some of the landscapes I've been in, there's just nothing. There's just no animals left in those landscapes, and they're going to take, if some of them ever come back, a long time to recover. And it's really hard for people like me because we know that didn't need to happen. Like in some of these areas, like because of the extreme climatic changes and weather, we saw firestorms which are unprecedented. But a lot of the fire in a lot of these landscapes wasn't that extreme. It just, the land wasn't being managed properly, so the animals are then going to suffer for that. So it's so critical that we understand the impacts, but also the changes. There's so much work to be done now in these landscapes, particularly from our point of view around restoring cultural fire regimes. So in a lot of these landscapes, the vegetation and the mismanagement meant that it was really hard to implement fire. Now there's huge amounts of the landscape that it's quite easy to implement the right fire to start to heal that land, so we don't end up with a ticking time bomb. Because I guarantee it, in huge areas where these fires were moderate to quite high intensity fires, where there's good possible regeneration of particularly shrubby species like wattles and tea trees and stuff, in the next 10 or 15 years, there'll be so much fuel in these landscapes, and the climate's not going in the right direction. We're going to have extreme weather events come through, droughts, heat waves, summer storms. So it's going to happen again. So if we don't get out there and start to heal that land, those animals, and particularly like the tree loss, there's so many trees that have been wiped out. They've survived 100, 200 years of inappropriate fires, and this last one was just too much. So we've got to make those changes. We've got to understand. And for me as a Bundjalung man, like a lot of Bundjalung country being impacted, but also spending time on a lot of other different cultural areas in the work that I do, knowing the cultural significance of these species as well, like knowing that there's story places and there's animals that, for some people, not that important, but for some people, that's their identity. It's the animal that, that they relate to, it's the place or the plant, so that cultural relationship is really important. And I think a lot of people just don't understand what that means, what it feels like to look at your landscape, and essentially it's, you've been burnt. Your identity has been stripped away. And knowing that you have solutions to that, it's really hard for people.
It goes even beyond that if you think about what's happening to bees, because so many species have been obliterated. These are a fundamental part of our ecosystem. And it goes, I hate to sound like an economist and try to put a price on everything, but sometimes that's all that politicians will respond to. To me, it's, when you saw those, the kangaroos and the koalas coming through, it's such an emotional reaction. I can't stand to see anything hurt. Even reading about they're thinking that the little whiteback funnel web spider, has been lost. And that's the thing, we're getting more and more research showing the loss of these different species. We could put values on it if we wanted to, but surely there's a broader issue here around the costs of disruption to our whole ecosystem. But if you want to just be very economic about it, if we don't have koalas, there's a lot of tourism that's not going to be around. So, but it's a shocking thing to see.
Cass, are there recommendations that stand out to you that would not be that hard for governments to implement?
Definitely. So tomorrow we could get from the government a bundle of things to give people some sense of confidence and assurance that if your community is going to be hit by this kind of disaster, that at least the basic protections are going to be in place. And so we need our social security system. That's the one where your job goes, it's a disaster, it rips through a community. In the short term, what do you rely on? It is social security, that income support, job seeker. We got a doubling of the payment, as you know, Kerry, $550 per week now for this period. People have just got their head above water. There are people in all these communities around the country right now affected by no jobs since the bushfires. That's what they're relying on. So again, the government has to have a heart and a head and make sure that those dollars are kept in those local economies so people can at least get by. Secondly, we need that disaster recovery payment. Now, this is a payment it was $1,000, Kerry, 15 years ago. Now, the government increased it a bit, but actually it needs to be at least $3,000. One of the things we learned is how crucial it is that people have dollars as quickly as possible. Now, the best way to do that is
the sort of dollars that'll go straight back into the economy.
Straight back into the economy. The government can make that a policy tomorrow to say that if we need to press the button in a particular area, that is the amount of money that people will get. And similarly, that in the short term at least, you won't be required to do job search obligations, etc. Now, all these things were done in the face of the terrible events of the summer, but the government could now say, we've learned our lessons, these are key policies that they are given, we assure you that this is what will happen. And similarly for the...
You mean it becomes a template for the future?
A standard response. As part of the disaster response, this is a given, your community assured, this is what you know will be implemented in your area. And then for community organisations and others that get government funding, but usually government funding, of course, is tied to particular activities. Now, Greg talked about trust and flexibility. Governments need to give those local community organisations trust and flexibility. If you are declared a disaster area, do with those precious dollars what you think you need to do right now. Go be where you need to be. Don't worry about breaching your contracts, etc. So there's a bundle of these in those recommendations, the 100 plus recommendations, Kerry. It's a bundle and you can pull them out as a template and say this bit is the protocol for government promises that in the face of this kind of event next summer, these things will just happen. And it's very clear.
And it could apply whether it's bushfires, whether it's floods,
Absolutely.
whether it's cyclones. So, Greg Mullins, in summary, what has the summit achieved and how would you now seek to sustain momentum?
Look, the big thing that it's achieved, Kerry, is it's brought together disparate groups of people from a myriad of different walks of life with different expertise. We've created networks that we're going to sustain. We'll keep talking. Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, thank you to my 32 Fire and Emergency Service Chief colleagues for helping make this happen in the Climate Council. But we'll now expand that network. We hope people will learn from our experience that if you have expertise, you can speak up. You don't have to be silenced by politicians or anybody else when you're speaking the truth. And the more people we can educate, the more likely we are to get action. So look, there's detailed recommendations there. We'll be taking those to the Prime Minister, to the government, to the opposition, to state and territory governments, the Royal Commission, and we hope that they pick them up and go, this is a great template, thank you very much, you've done a lot of our work for us.
And next year and the year after, can you keep this coalition of interest groups together? Because the nasty irony in all of this is that the most effective way of keeping this kind of coalition going is that you have more crises, and that's what we don't want.
But I think, Kerry, if I can just say on that point, I mean, none of us ignore the fact that we've just seen a doubling of unemployment in Australia. We, as you say, this is as serious as it gets now for us. And so we have to be razor sharp with what we do every single day to make sure that we are properly investing in the jobs that are needed. Let's make them the jobs that are delivering on these good outcomes. There's something really powerful in that. And so I think whether governments like it or not, communities are determined that we are going to work together. That's what this has demonstrated. And if I was a good political leader, I'd want to be a part of it. And we really hope they will partner with us because there's a huge amount of community goodwill and determination because really lives are at stake. And, you know, that's what we've all seen. And that's what great political leadership looks like, to get behind this and not wait for the next disaster to come. You know, we're in it right now. And at the same time, we want to give our children a sense that we're up for it, aren't we? To make it better?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think now is, you know, like the bushfires, and I think people see this as an opportunity for change, and this people have got a really clear perspective on what needs to change, and so it's really, I think, in the best interest of everybody to support that change in a really positive way and you know, heal the land. Like people, you know, we need to work together in a meaningful way so we can actually live in a really meaningful way together. So now's the time.
But politicians' attention spans are short. And, you know, unless they're dealing with the crisis of the moment, I get your point, Harry. But unfortunately, what I also see is that, you know, it's not going to be that long until the next one. It may not be a fire, it might be another cyclone, but there'll be another fire back. You know, there'll be other big disasters coming. Unfortunately, that's the whole thing that's tied up with climate change. So they may put it aside for a small period of time, but they won't have long before it's back on the agenda. And it's, you know, beholden on all of us who are involved in this space to just keep saying the message over and over again. You know, COVID shouldn't be a distraction from climate change. It should be a damn wake-up call.
Absolutely.
This is the disruption that we're looking go on and on into the future if we don't act.
And on that, on COVID, there's a curve we could drive down, and I've said a number of times, climate change is a straight line going that way. We have to cap it, level off, and then eventually go down, because that is the emergency. We're in the midst of a climate emergency. We have plans. Climate Council has a plan for 76,000 green jobs. We've got plans to make communities more resilient, but it takes leadership from Canberra to line up with the states and territories who all have net zero emissions policies. Let's get on with it. Let's help save the world.
Been a big exercise mounting this summit. And rolling through all of those round tables and all the rest of it, and of course now you've got to keep it going. I imagine that you've got to keep your own critical mass of supporters.
Look, Kerry, one of the most humbling things about this was that we put out a call for people to help us run the summit, and people dug into their pockets. Individuals, organisations became donors. And without them, this wouldn't have happened. So I just want to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you out there who dug into your pockets and helped us do this, and keep up that pressure on governments to take action. We can do this if we all work together.
And that brings this Climate Change Summit to an end after 7 weeks of round tables and a blueprint for urgent action that will be presented to state and federal governments, in the hope that with the next fire season just a few scant months away, they will read, they will listen, and they will act. My thanks to the panel for a very productive conversation, and thanks to all of you who have joined us from around Australia and indeed beyond our shores, and for the interest and engagement reflected in your presence too. Thank you.